Never mistake the way a woman arrives for the power she carries. At 7:48 on a gray Tuesday morning in Boston, Claire Whitmore stood beneath the cracked glass roof of a bus stop on Atlantic Avenue, one hand wrapped around the strap of a worn leather bag, the other tucked inside the pocket of her beige coat as a thin autumn rain silvered the street around her. The bus was 6 minutes late, which meant the entire city seemed determined to test her patience before breakfast. A delivery truck hissed past the curb, spraying cold water over the gutter. A man in a navy overcoat glanced at her shoes, then at the folder under her arm, and looked away with the bored efficiency of someone who had already decided she was no one important. Claire almost smiled. She had grown used to that particular kind of invisibility. It was softer than cruelty, but in some ways more useful. People said things around invisible women. They revealed themselves. They underestimated silence. The bus finally groaned into view, its brakes sighing like an old man tired of carrying everyone else's bad decisions. Claire climbed aboard, tapped her transit card, and took a seat near the middle, beside a fogged window streaked with rain. Her reflection floated there, pale and composed, brown hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, no diamond earrings, no designer coat, no glossy evidence of the kind of money people respected in boardrooms. Just a woman nearing 40, dressed simply, carrying a navy folder that held more power than any luxury handbag Ethan Caldwell had ever bought to impress strangers. Inside that folder were 3 things: a signed acquisition agreement, a voting proxy from Northline Capital Group, and an old handwritten note Ethan had left for her the year their marriage began to rot from the inside. She had kept it not because she missed him, not because pain made her sentimental, but because some insults were worth preserving until the day they could be answered properly. "You were never built for rooms where real decisions are made," he had written after one of their arguments, back when he still believed confidence was the same thing as intelligence. Back then, Claire had been the wife who remembered every client's birthday, corrected Ethan's investor decks at midnight, soothed anxious vendors he had forgotten to pay, and smiled beside him at charity dinners while he accepted praise for strategies she had sketched on yellow legal pads at their kitchen island. He called it support. She later learned the more accurate word was erasure. The bus rolled past glass towers, coffee shops, law offices, and people moving quickly with paper cups in their hands, each convinced their destination mattered more than anyone else's. Claire watched the city wake behind the rain and felt no rush of triumph, no sharp hunger for revenge. That would have been too simple, and life had never been considerate enough to be simple. What she felt was steadier. 5 years after Ethan took the house, the company title, the friends, and the version of the story people preferred to believe, Claire was riding a city bus to the headquarters of Caldwell and Pierce Manufacturing. By noon, if the board did exactly what their own fear would force them to do, she would own the company he thought had forgotten her name. The bus left Claire 2 blocks from Caldwell and Pierce because the closest stop had been rerouted for construction, a small inconvenience that felt almost poetic, as if even the city wanted her to earn the last stretch on foot. By the time she reached the company's headquarters, the rain had softened into mist, leaving a silver sheen across the pavement and the polished black doors of the lobby. The building rose above her in 22 floors of glass and steel, all sharp angles and cold confidence, the kind of place Ethan had once described as proof that he was destined for more than ordinary life. Claire remembered standing beside him at the ribbon cutting 8 years earlier, holding his speech cards in one hand and a coffee he had forgotten to drink in the other, while reporters photographed him beneath the new company logo. Not one camera had turned toward her. She had told herself then that love did not require credit, that marriage was not a ledger, that being unseen was not the same as being used. People believe many generous lies when they are trying to survive a life they helped build. The lobby smelled exactly as she remembered: lemon polish, fresh flowers, and expensive coffee from the private cafe near the elevators. A security guard looked up from his desk, his eyes moving from her damp coat to the folder in her arms. For one brief second, Claire saw the question form in his expression. Delivery? Interview? Wrong building? Then he asked for her name with professional politeness. "Claire Whitmore," she said. His fingers paused over the keyboard. Recognition flickered, then vanished behind the neutral mask employees learn when powerful people have messy histories. "You are on the list for the 10 o'clock board meeting," he said, handing her a visitor badge. Visitor. The word hung from the lanyard like a small joke written by a universe with poor manners. Claire clipped it to her coat anyway. She was halfway across the marble floor when the private elevator opened and Ethan Caldwell stepped out with Vanessa Cole beside him. Both of them dressed as if the morning had been designed around their reflection. Ethan wore a charcoal suit, perfectly tailored, with the same silver watch he used to tap whenever he wanted a conversation to end. Vanessa's cream blazer was immaculate, her blonde hair swept back, her smile already sharpened before she knew who she was smiling at. Ethan saw Claire first. The change in his face was almost invisible to anyone who had not once loved him, but Claire saw it clearly. Surprise, irritation, then amusement, pulled over both like a curtain. "Claire," he said, loud enough for the receptionist and two junior analysts to hear. "I did not realize the public tours started this early." Vanessa's gaze dropped to Claire's shoes, still wet from the walk, then to the rain-darkened sleeve of her coat. "Did you come all the way here by bus?" she asked, her voice sweet enough to pass as harmless if no one listened too closely. One of the analysts looked down at his tablet, suddenly fascinated by whatever tragedy lived there. Claire did not answer right away. She simply adjusted the folder under her arm and looked past them toward the elevators, where her reflection stood between theirs. In the polished metal doors, Ethan gave a soft laugh. "This is not a community meeting, Claire. The board is discussing serious financial decisions today." There it was, the old rhythm, the familiar attempt to reduce her before anyone else could decide what she was worth. Years ago, she would have felt heat climb into her face. She would have explained herself, defended herself, tried to prove she belonged in a room that had survived for years on work he pretended was his alone. This morning, she only looked at the clock above the reception desk. It was 9:31. "Then it is good I am early," she said. Vanessa's smile tightened. Ethan's did not survive at all. Claire stepped into the elevator with Ethan and Vanessa because turning away would have given them the tiny satisfaction of thinking they had moved her. The doors closed with a soft metallic hush, sealing the three of them inside a mirrored box that reflected every imbalance of their old life back at her. Ethan stood near the control panel as if even the buttons belonged to him. Vanessa checked her phone, her thumb moving quickly, her expression bright with the private pleasure of a person sending a message she believed would never matter. Claire saw just enough of the screen in the mirror to read the first line before Vanessa tilted it away. "Guess who arrived by public transport?" It was followed by a small laughing face, the kind of casual cruelty people use when they are too polished to raise their voices. Claire filed it away without blinking. The elevator rose past the 10th floor, then the 15th, and with each number, the building seemed to pull her backward through time. She remembered the first rented office Caldwell and Pierce had occupied in a converted warehouse outside Cambridge, back when Ethan still answered his own phone and the company could barely afford decent chairs. He had been charming then, dangerously certain, full of speeches about legacy and American manufacturing and bringing dignity back to factory work. Claire had believed him. More than that, she had helped him sound believable. She had written the grant proposal that paid for their first automated cutting system. She had caught the error in a supplier contract that would have cost them $80,000 before their first full year ended. Relief. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." Ethan's head turned toward him. Vanessa's phone lowered. Claire shook Robert's hand and felt the room shift before she had even entered it. Not enough for everyone to understand. Just enough for the first crack to appear. The boardroom was colder than Claire remembered, though she doubted anyone responsible for the thermostat would have called it cold. Rooms like that were always described as climate-controlled, as if discomfort became professional when it was expensive. The long walnut table stretched beneath a row of recessed lights, polished so brightly it reflected the faces gathered around it in pale, distorted versions of themselves. 12 chairs were filled, most by men and women Claire recognized from annual reports, charity photographs, and the quiet damage of old decisions. Robert Hensley took the seat at the head of the table. Ethan moved automatically toward the chair to Robert's right, the one he had always treated like a throne waiting to become official. Vanessa slipped into the seat behind him along the wall, not a board member, not an officer with voting authority, but present because Ethan liked an audience that smiled on command. Claire was directed to a chair near the far end, close to a sideboard with silver coffee urns and untouched pastries arranged in neat little rows. It was not an accident. Ethan had always understood placement. He knew how to make a person feel included while keeping them distant enough to appear irrelevant. Claire sat without complaint, placed her bag at her feet, and laid the navy folder on the table in front of her. The visitor badge rested against her coat, like a label someone else had chosen. Across from her, a younger board member named Paul Merrick glanced at the badge, then at her face, and offered the thin smile people give when they are trying to remember whether they should know you. "Will Mrs. Whitmore be giving a statement?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the careful confusion of someone who had been handed only half the agenda. Ethan answered before Robert could. "Claire is here because the transaction touches on certain legacy matters from the divorce," he said smoothly. "Nothing that should slow us down." There it was again, the elegant burial. Legacy matters. Divorce. The harmless language powerful men used to turn stolen work into personal history and personal history into paperwork. Claire opened her notebook and wrote the time at the top of a blank page. 9:44, Ethan noticed. "Taking minutes?" he asked, and a few people gave uncertain laughs because they were not sure whether the joke was safe yet. Claire looked up. "No," she said, keeping track. The laughter died politely, which was the preferred death of laughter in expensive rooms. Robert cleared his throat and began reviewing the crisis that had brought them together: declining cash reserves, delayed supplier payments, a federal contract at risk, and an acquisition proposal from Northline Capital Group that had arrived with unusual speed and unusually clean terms. As he spoke, Claire watched Ethan lean back, performing calm with every inch of his body. He nodded at the right moments. He frowned as if the numbers were disappointing but manageable. He even tapped his pen twice when Robert mentioned the debt covenant breach, the old signal Ethan used when he wanted everyone to move past a subject before it became dangerous. Claire remembered that tap. She had heard it across dinner tables, lawyer offices, and the final mediation session where Ethan's attorney called her contributions informal support. Informal support had kept this company alive through its first 3 investor rounds. Informal support had taught Ethan which factory supervisor had a sick wife, which client preferred morning calls, which lender hated surprises, and which promises should never be made without a second supplier in writing. But in the official story, Claire had been decorative. A wife. A footnote in heels. The company had not simply forgotten her. It had benefited from forgetting her. When Robert finished, Ethan leaned forward and smiled at the board with practiced reassurance. "Northline's offer is strong, but let us be clear. This company needs continuity. The employees need to see familiar leadership. Our clients need confidence. I am prepared to remain through the transition and protect what I built." Claire's pen stopped moving, not because the lie surprised her, but because the word built still had the power to reveal how completely he misunderstood the past. Robert turned one page in his packet. "Before we discuss leadership continuity, we need to address disclosure." Ethan's smile thinned. "Disclosure?" "The pension reserve collateralization," Robert said. The room changed so quietly that anyone outside it would have missed the sound. A chair shifted. A coffee cup touched its saucer. Vanessa looked up from her phone. Claire reached into her folder, removed a single bank report, and placed it on the table with 2 fingers. She did not slide it toward anyone yet. She only let it exist in the room. Ethan stared at the paper as if paper had no right to look back. For a moment, no one touched the bank report. It lay between them with the quiet authority of a sealed door, and Claire let the silence do what years of explanation never could. Ethan recovered first, because men like Ethan had spent their whole lives mistaking speed for control. "Robert, this is unnecessary," he said, his voice still polished, but no longer smooth. The collateral arrangement was temporary, perfectly legal, a bridge measure to protect payroll and supplier continuity. Claire looked at him across the length of the table. Was it disclosed to the employees whose pension reserves were pledged? The question landed without drama, which made it worse. Paul Merrick shifted in his chair. A woman named Diane Fletcher, who had served on the compensation committee for 9 years, reached for her glasses and leaned forward. "I was not aware pension reserves had been used as collateral," she said. Ethan lifted one hand in a calming gesture, the same gesture he used in interviews when reporters asked about layoffs. "Because the board approved a liquidity framework last quarter. This falls under that umbrella." "No," Robert said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of a door closing. It does not. Vanessa's face changed then, not enough for sympathy, but enough to reveal calculation. Her eyes moved from Ethan to the report, then to Claire, as if she were seeing the damp coat, the simple shoes, and the visitor badge rearrange themselves into something she should have feared sooner. Claire slid the report down the table. It stopped in front of Robert, who did not need to read it because, Claire suspected, he had already seen a version of it. But now everyone else had to see it too. That was the difference between knowledge and accountability. Knowledge could hide in private offices. Accountability preferred a table, witnesses, and a clock that kept moving. It was 10:12. Less than 3 hours earlier, Claire had been standing at a bus stop while strangers decided she was ordinary. Now 12 board members watched Ethan Caldwell explain why ordinary people's retirements had become temporary leverage in a private rescue plan he had not had the courage to name. "Where did you get this?" Ethan asked. Not denial, not outrage, just the first honest question he had asked all morning. Claire closed her notebook. "From the same place I got most of what mattered when we were married, Ethan. By paying attention." A few eyes dropped, not out of embarrassment for her. For him. That distinction was small, but Claire felt it like sunlight under a closed curtain. Robert turned to the corporate secretary. "Please enter the report into the record." The secretary nodded, typing quickly. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I object to documents being introduced by someone who has no formal position in this company." Claire opened the navy folder and removed another page. This one cream-colored, clean, and signed in blue ink. She placed it in front of her, but did not push it forward yet. "That may change before lunch," she said. The room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan stared at the document, then gave a short laugh that did not reach his eyes. "Claire, whatever game you think you are playing, this is not the place." She remembered him saying something almost identical 5 years earlier in a mediator's office, when she had asked why her name had disappeared from internal strategy files she had written. "This is not the place, Claire. Not the time. Not your field." Human beings have a remarkable talent for building cages out of polite phrases. Claire had lived in one long enough to learn every bar by touch. "This is exactly the place," she said. Robert folded his hands on the table. "Ethan, Northline Capital's representatives are scheduled to join us at 11. "Then let them join," Ethan replied, too quickly. "We need their capital, not theatrics." "Agreed," Claire said. "The company needs capital. It also needs clean governance, honest books, and leadership that does not treat workers like collateral damage hidden in footnotes." Diane Fletcher picked up the report, her mouth tightening as she scanned the figures. Paul Merrick whispered something to the director beside him. Vanessa stopped typing. The polished room, so carefully designed to flatter authority, had begun to turn against the man who believed authority belonged to him by habit. Claire looked toward the wall of framed photographs beyond Robert's shoulder, at Ethan smiling beside machines he had barely understood and workers he called family only when cameras were present. She did not feel victorious. Not yet. Victory was too loud a word for a morning built on documents, memory, and restraint. What she felt was alignment, the quiet click of a lock accepting the right key. At 10:27, the door opened and Margaret Ellis entered with the kind of composure that made noise feel unnecessary. She was a tall woman in her early 60s, with silver hair cut neatly at her jaw and a black leather briefcase in one hand. Claire had known Margaret for only 14 months, but in that time she had learned there were people who spoke to fill rooms and people who entered rooms already full of meaning. Margaret belonged to the second category. She gave Robert a brief nod, acknowledged the board with a calm glance, and took the empty seat beside Claire as if it had been reserved for her by history itself. Ethan stared at her with open irritation. "Counsel for Northline?" he asked. Margaret set her briefcase on the table. "Counsel for Ms. Whitmore," she said. The words moved through the room like a current under still water. Vanessa blinked first. Paul Merrick turned one page in his packet even though no one had asked him. 2. Ethan looked at Claire, then back to Margaret, trying to assemble a version of reality that still placed him in the center. "Claire does not require counsel for a board discussion," he said. Margaret opened the briefcase and removed a narrow stack of documents, each clipped, marked, and tabbed with an elegance that made the chaos of the company's finances seem even more damning. "This is no longer merely a board discussion," she replied. It is a transaction review involving material non-disclosure, governance concerns, and voting rights that my client is prepared to exercise. My client. Claire had heard those words in another room years earlier, but then they had belonged to Ethan's attorneys, spoken over her as if she were a problem to be managed. Today, the words stood beside her. It was strange how dignity could arrive in legal language, wearing reading glasses and carrying certified copies. Ethan gave a controlled smile. Voting rights. Yes, Margaret said. Through Northline Capital Group. Diane Fletcher lowered the pension report. Northline is represented by Ms. Whitmore. Margaret looked toward Claire, and Claire gave the smallest nod. It was not permission exactly. It was timing. Margaret placed the first document in the center of the table. Northline Capital Group is a privately held investment entity. Its controlling member is Claire and Whitmore. No one spoke. The silence was not empty. It had weight, color, temperature. It pressed against the windows and settled over the table, turning every polished surface honest. Ethan's face did not collapse all at once. It changed in stages, disbelief first, then calculation, then something smaller and more human that almost resembled fear of humiliation. That is impossible, he said. Claire looked at him steadily. You keep using that word for things you failed to notice. Robert reached for the document and read the signature page. His expression did not change, but his shoulders seemed to loosen, as if he had been carrying a fact in secret and was grateful to set it down. Northline has accumulated a substantial secured position, Margaret continued. It also holds binding purchase agreements from 3 minority shareholders, pending board recognition and final approval of the emergency recapitalization package. Ethan stood halfway from his chair, then stopped himself, perhaps remembering there were witnesses. Claire could not have built a fund capable of acquiring this company. Not alone, Claire said. No one builds anything alone. That was always the part you had trouble admitting. A director near the middle of the table, a former banker named Samuel Price, leaned forward. How long has this been in motion? Claire folded her hands. Long enough to understand the debt. Long enough to speak with suppliers who were being stalled. Long enough to learn which employees were afraid their retirements had been put at risk. Long enough to know this company did not need a savior with a better suit. It needed an owner who could still remember the people inside it. Vanessa's phone buzzed against the wall behind Ethan. No one looked at it. The little message she had sent that morning, the joke about public transport, seemed to hover invisibly over her like cheap perfume in an expensive room. Ethan sat down slowly. For the first time since Claire had known him, he seemed unsure which mask to wear. At 10:41, Margaret slid the acquisition framework toward Robert, and Claire watched Ethan's eyes follow it across the table. A simple motion. Paper on wood. Yet somehow, it sounded like the old story ending. At 10:58, the boardroom doors opened again, and 2 men from Northline Capital entered carrying nothing more dramatic than slim laptops and a black document case, which somehow made their arrival feel more final than any grand entrance could have. The taller one introduced himself as Andrew Keene, managing director. The other, a quiet analyst named Miles Porter, began connecting his laptop to the room's display without looking at Ethan once. Claire had chosen them carefully, not for flash, not for charm, but for competence, that increasingly endangered species in rooms where ego reproduced faster than good judgment. Andrew placed a printed agenda in front of Robert, then another in front of Claire. He did not place one before Ethan until Ethan reached for it. Himself, a small delay no one mentioned, and everyone noticed. Northline is prepared to proceed with the emergency recapitalization, Andrew said, subject to revised governance terms and immediate disclosure correction. Ethan gave a tight smile. And by Northline, you mean Claire? Andrew turned to him. I mean Northline Capital Group, whose controlling member is Ms. Whitmore. The correction was polite, clean, and merciless in the way only professional language can be when it has stopped pretending. The screen at the end of the room lit up with a timeline of the company's debt, supplier delays, and missed reporting thresholds. There were no emotional words on the slide. No betrayal. No arrogance. No years of Claire being made invisible. Just dates, figures, signatures, and obligations. The kind of evidence that did not care how expensive Ethan's suit was. Margaret passed copies down the table while Andrew explained the structure. Northline would assume the secured debt, inject $24 million in operating capital, protect payroll for the next 18 months, and renegotiate supplier contracts already strained by late payment cycles. In exchange, Northline would receive controlling equity, 3 board seats, and authority to appoint interim leadership pending an independent review. It was not a rescue dressed as charity. It was a takeover with a conscience, which made it more insulting to Ethan than a hostile one might have been. He could have understood cruelty. He respected cruelty when it wore a tailored jacket and called itself strategy. What he could not understand was Claire saving the company while removing him from the center of it. "This is absurd," he said, his voice flatter now. "You are asking this board to hand control of an established manufacturing firm to someone with no executive operating history." Claire turned one page in her packet. "That is not accurate." Ethan almost laughed. "Claire, you ran a household. I ran the parts of your life you did not want investors to see," she said. The room went still again, not shocked this time, but attentive. There is a difference. Shock belongs to people surprised by a fact. Attention belongs to people beginning to understand one. Claire did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I managed vendor relationships when your first operations director quit. I rebuilt the customer retention plan after you lost the Northeast Hospital contract. I drafted the original workforce stability proposal that helped secure the state tax credit in 2018. My name is not on those documents because you removed it, but the metadata, email chains, and revision history still exist." Miles Porter clicked once. The screen changed. A document appeared, then another, then another. Claire Whitmore. Draft owner. Claire Whitmore. Revision notes. Claire Whitmore. Strategy outline. The evidence did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like lights turning on one by one in a house everyone had pretended was empty. Diane Fletcher covered her mouth with 2 fingers, not in theatrics, but in the quiet discomfort of a person realizing she had voted for years inside a story that had been edited. Samuel Price leaned back, his expression unreadable. Robert kept his eyes on Ethan. Ethan's face had gone pale beneath the careful tan he maintained through winter. "Those were informal contributions," he said. "No," Claire replied. "They were unpaid contributions. There is a difference." Vanessa stood near the wall now, phone clutched against her blazer, her earlier confidence thinning into something brittle. Claire glanced at her only once. Not with anger, with recognition. Vanessa had believed she was standing beside power. Claire almost pitted her for discovering so publicly that sometimes power is just debt wearing cologne. At 11:17, Robert called for a short procedural confirmation. Margaret handed him the voting proxies. Andrew Keene confirmed Northline's executed purchase agreements. The corporate secretary read the names into the record. When she reached the final page, her voice hesitated for half a second before steadying. "Controlling member, Claire and Whitmore." This time, no one questioned it. Ethan looked toward Claire as if waiting for her to smile, gloat, perform victory in a way that would make it easier to dismiss her. She gave him nothing. That was the worst part for him, she knew. Not that she had come back. Not that she had money. Not that the board was listening. The worst part was that she no longer needed him to understand. The procedural confirmation took 14 minutes, though to Ethan it seemed to stretch far longer. Each signature and verification another small public lesson in how little control he had left. Claire watched him through the reflections on the table rather than directly, because direct attention was something he still knew how to perform against. In the glossy walnut surface, his face appeared thinner, less certain, fractured by the shine of overhead lights and the neat rows of documents that had begun to surround him like evidence in a life he had edited too aggressively. Robert Hensley asked the corporate secretary to read the voting thresholds aloud. She did, carefully, her voice steadying as the legal structure became impossible to misunderstand. Northline Capital held enough secured debt to force immediate restructuring. Northline had signed agreements from minority shareholders sufficient to shift control once the emergency package was accepted. Northline had capital ready before the end of business. Caldwell and Pierce had payroll due Friday. Supplier payments were already 21 days late. The federal contract review was scheduled for the following Monday. The facts did not shout. They did not need to. They lined up patiently, like people at a bus stop, waiting for the moment when everyone finally had to admit they were going somewhere. Ethan tried one more angle, Because humiliation often makes pride inventive. He leaned towards Samuel Price and Diane Fletcher, lowering his voice into the tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable to everyone except the person he was undermining. We are all impressed by Claire's preparation, but preparation is not leadership. This company has relationships, unions, compliance requirements, military-grade supply standards. It cannot be managed from a personal grudge. Claire felt the old word before he even finished speaking. Grudge. That convenient little container men used for women's memory when the truth became too organized to dismiss. Margaret. Ellis made a note, but Claire raised one hand gently before her attorney could answer. You are right about one thing, Claire said. This company cannot be managed from a grudge. Ethan's eyes narrowed, sensing a door and not yet realizing it was closing behind him. Claire continued, her voice even. That is why I am not asking to run it as punishment for what happened between us. I am asking this board to approve an interim leadership plan with an experienced operations officer, an independent financial review, and worker protections in writing. I am not here to sit in your chair because it used to impress you. I am here because the people who actually keep this place alive deserve better than another quarter of your image management. The phrase moved through the room with a quiet force. Image management. It was clean, almost corporate, and therefore impossible for Ethan to call emotional without sounding foolish. Robert looked down at the proposal again. Northline's interim chief operating officer is listed as Marjorie Bell. Samuel Price looked up. From Ashmont Industrial? Andrew Keene nodded. 26 years in manufacturing operations. 3 successful turnaround processes. No layoffs in the last 2 restructurings. Diane Fletcher exhaled softly. That is not a vanity appointment. No, Claire said. It is not. Vanessa shifted behind Ethan, and the movement drew Claire's attention for only a second. The younger woman was staring at Ethan now with a look Claire knew too well, the first clear recognition that charm could be a beautifully wrapped liability. Vanessa had admired power when it sparkled. She had not studied what happened when the lights turned on and the invoices came due. Ethan turned toward Claire, his voice dropping. You planned this for months. Yes. You watched me struggle. I watched you hide the struggle from everyone it would hurt. You could have called me. Claire looked at him then, fully, calmly, without the ache that used to live beneath his name. You spent years teaching me that my voice did not belong in your business. I believed you for too long. That was my mistake. I corrected it. No one moved. Somewhere beyond the thick glass walls, an assistant laughed at something in the hallway, a normal office sound from a world that did not yet know the ground under it had shifted. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. For once, there was no polished sentence waiting to save him. At 11:36, Robert called for the vote on Northline's emergency recapitalization and governance terms. One by one, the directors answered. Yes, yes, yes. Abstain. Yes, yes. The words were ordinary, almost dull. That was the strange mercy of real power. It rarely looked like thunder from inside the room. Sometimes it sounded like tired people choosing the only honest option left. By 11:43, the vote was complete, and the company Ethan Caldwell had treated like an extension of his own reflection had legally shifted beyond his reach. No champagne appeared. No one applauded. Real consequences, Claire had learned, rarely arrived with music. They arrived through signatures, timestamps, and the exhausted faces of people realizing the future had just changed while they were sitting in ergonomic chairs. Committee, employee pension protections, and suspension of discretionary executive spending pending review. Is that correct? Claire nodded. Yes. I would also like the board to authorize direct communication to all employees by 3 o'clock today. No rumors. No vague assurances. They deserve to hear what happened in plain English. Diane Fletcher looked at her for a long second, then gave a small nod. Agreed. Ethan's chair scraped softly as he pushed back. You are going to tell them I endangered their pensions before the audit is even finished. Claire looked at him. I am going to tell them their pensions are protected before they hear anything else. The distinction settled between them, simple and devastating. Ethan had spent his career managing perception. Claire was managing harm. Robert tapped his pen once. The communication should be reviewed by counsel, but I support the principle. Margaret made a note. Ethan gave a bitter little laugh, quiet enough to seem controlled, loud enough to beg for attention. Principle. That is rich. Claire did not respond. She was reading the final acquisition page, checking the name, date, and transfer language. Claire and Whitmore. Controlling member. Northline Capital Group. For years, her name had disappeared from documents she had shaped. Now it sat in black ink at the center of one Ethan could not edit. Andrew placed a pen beside her hand. It was not fancy, not ceremonial, just a company pin from the conference room tray, the kind visitors used to sign non-disclosure agreements and delivery confirmations. Somehow, that made it better. Claire signed once. Margaret turned the page. Claire signed again. Robert signed after her, then Diane, then Samuel, then the remaining directors in sequence. The packet moved around the table with the solemn awkwardness of a family Bible at a wedding no one had expected to attend. When the last signature was finished, Miles checked the time. 11:56, he said. Execution complete. For one strange second, Claire heard nothing but the ventilation system and rain tapping lightly against the glass. 5 years ago, she had left a mediation office with a settlement designed to make her quiet and a reputation designed to make her small. She had carried home a cardboard box of personal things Ethan's assistant had packed for her. 2 framed photographs, a cracked mug, a planner, and a folder of documents she was told no longer mattered. Human beings underestimate folders. It is practically a national hobby. Ethan stood abruptly. I need to speak with you privately. Claire closed the signed packet and handed it to Margaret. No, the word was gentle, and that made it final. Anything regarding the company goes through counsel and the board now. His face tightened. Claire. Ms. Whitmore, Robert corrected quietly. Ethan looked at Robert as if betrayal had chosen an unexpected uniform. Claire rose from her chair, lifting her worn leather bag from the floor. The visitor badge still hung from her coat, absurd and perfect. She unclipped it, placed it neatly on the table, and looked once at the room that had finally learned how to pronounce her name. Claire left the boardroom at 12:01 with Margaret Ellis on one side and Andrew Keene on the other, though she did not feel escorted so much as accompanied by the strange, formal quiet that follows a decision no one can pretend away. Behind her, the room remained full of people rearranging papers, calendars, authority, and blame. Ethan did not follow immediately. That surprised her less than it might have years ago. He had always needed an audience before he could decide who to be, and the audience had just changed its mind about him. In the corridor, assistants looked up from their desks with the alert stillness of people who sensed history moving through the office but had not yet received the company email. Claire passed the framed photographs again, the governors, the factory tours, the award ceremonies, the smiling version of Ethan standing in front of machines he called American Innovation whenever donors were nearby. For the first time, those photographs looked less like monuments and more like evidence of a story that had been overlit. Near the elevator, Margaret touched Claire's arm gently. The employee statement will be ready within the hour. I will make sure the language is clear. Claire nodded. Start with the pensions. They should not have to wait until paragraph 6 to find out they are safe. Margaret's expression softened in a way she probably reserved for clients who remembered that legal victories still belonged to human beings. I will. Andrew checked his phone. The wire confirmation should arrive by 12:30. Marjorie Bell is already on her way from Worcester. She can meet with operations by late afternoon. Good, Claire said. The word felt too small for the size of what had just happened, but Claire had never trusted big speeches in hallways. Big speeches were Ethan's territory, and look where that glittering little kingdom had brought everyone. The elevator doors opened. Before Claire could step inside, Ethan's voice came from behind her. Claire. She stopped, not because he had the right to stop her, but because some chapters deserve a period written in person. Margaret looked at her, silently asking whether to stay. Claire gave the smallest shake of her head. Margaret and Andrew stepped into the elevator, and the doors closed between them with a soft chime. Ethan stood 15 feet away, his suit still perfect, his face not. Vanessa was nowhere in sight. That absence spoke with almost comic efficiency. You humiliated me, he said. There it was. Not you saved the company. Not are the employees really protected. Not I should have told the board. Just the wound to his reflection, held up like a national emergency. Claire looked at him and felt, to her own surprise, not anger but a tired kind of clarity. No, Ethan. I documented you. His mouth tightened. You could have warned me. I did warn you. For years. I warned you when vendors stopped trusting your promises. I warned you when employees were afraid to speak honestly around you. I warned you when you started treating the company like a mirror instead of a responsibility. He looked away first, toward the row of photographs on the wall. You always make it sound like you were the only one who cared. No, she said. I was just one of the few who cared when no one was watching. The hallway seemed too bright suddenly, every recessed light exposing the distance between who they had been and who they were now. Ethan lowered his voice. Did any of it matter to you? Us. Claire almost laughed, but not cruelly. Human beings are astonishing. Give them a collapsing company, pension risk, years of erasure, and somehow they will still ask whether the ruins were romantic. It mattered, she said. That was the problem. I let what mattered to me protect what was harming me. For the first time, he had no answer prepared. The elevator returned, opening behind her. Claire stepped inside. Ethan moved as if he might say something else, but the doors began to close. Through the narrowing gap, she saw him framed by the photographs, a man surrounded by proof of a life that had required too many people to disappear. When the elevator descended, Claire exhaled for what felt like the first time all morning. In the lobby, the security guard stood when he saw her, not dramatically, not with fear, but with the startled respect of someone who had just received an update from upstairs. Ms. Whitmore, he said, reaching for the visitor log. You can leave the badge here. Claire placed it on the desk. Outside, the rain had stopped. Boston shone under a thin wash of noon light, ordinary and indifferent, as cities tend to be after rearranging a person's life. A black car idled near the curb, sent by Northline, no doubt. Claire looked at it, then past it, toward the bus stop 2 blocks away. Her bag felt light on her shoulder. Her shoes were still damp. Her name was finally on the papers that mattered. And for reasons no one in that building would understand, she began walking back the way she had come. At the bus stop, Claire stood beneath the same cracked glass roof where the morning had begun, but the city around her seemed to have changed its posture. Or maybe she had. The rain had left behind a clean brightness on the pavement, and passing cars sent small flashes of sunlight across the wet street. People hurried by with lunch bags, briefcases, coffee cups, and the private impatience of a weekday, none of them knowing that 2 blocks away, a company had changed hands before most of them had decided what sandwich to buy. Claire found that strangely comforting. The world did not pause for a woman's vindication. It rarely paused for anyone. That was why a person had to learn how to stand inside a turning world and still know what had happened. The black Northline car remained at the curb near the building, its driver watching her from a distance with professional confusion. He raised one hand slightly, as if asking whether she had made a mistake. Claire shook her head once, not unkindly, and he lowered his hand. She did not reject the car because she wanted to perform humility. She had no interest in turning simplicity into theater. She had taken the bus that morning because it was practical, because it reminded her of the years when she had counted every dollar after the divorce, and because she refused to let Ethan's world teach her that comfort had to be displayed to be real. A woman at the stop, probably in her 20s, glanced at Claire's coat, then at the office tower behind her. She had a Caldwell and Pierce employee badge clipped to her backpack. Her eyes widened with the slow recognition of someone who had already received half a dozen urgent messages and did not yet know which ones were true. "Excuse me," the young woman said carefully. "Are you Ms. Whitmore?" Claire turned toward her. "I am." The young woman swallowed, nervous but determined. "My dad works at the Everett plant. He has been there 29 years. People were scared about the pension rumors." Claire felt something tighten in her chest, not pain exactly, but the old pressure of responsibility finding its proper shape. "The pensions will be protected," she said. "That will be in the employee statement today." The young woman nodded too quickly, as if trying not to show how much the answer mattered. "Thank you," she whispered. Those 2 words did what Ethan's shock had not. They reached Claire, not as praise, not as triumph, but as proof that the morning had never really been about him. It had been about the people whose names did not appear on donor walls, whose hands built the parts, packed the orders, answered the phones, swept the floors, and trusted men in better suits not to gamble with their futures. The bus arrived with a familiar sigh of brakes, its doors folding open like an invitation back into ordinary life. Claire stepped aboard, tapped her transit card, and took a seat by the window. As the bus pulled away, she saw Ethan through the glass entrance of the headquarters, standing in the lobby alone, small behind all that architecture. For years, she had imagined that seeing him diminished would feel like justice. Instead, justice looked different. It looked like signed protections, honest records, workers who could breathe again, her own name restored to places where it had always belonged. The bus turned onto Atlantic Avenue, carrying her past cafes, crosswalks, office workers, and delivery trucks, all the plain machinery of a city continuing. Claire rested her worn leather bag on her lap and placed one hand over the navy folder inside it. She had not become powerful that morning. Power had been growing quietly for years in savings accounts, late-night research, disciplined investments, difficult restraint, and the refusal to confuse being underestimated with being defeated. The world had mistaken her lack of display for lack of worth. Ethan had mistaken her silence for emptiness. They had all been wrong, and she had let them be wrong long enough for the truth to arrive with paperwork. As the bus moved through the noon light, Claire closed her eyes for one stop, just one, and allowed herself the smallest smile. Not because she had taken something from him, because at last, she had stopped asking anyone's permission to own what she had built. 3 days later, the first employee meeting under Northline's ownership was held at the Everett plant, not in the glass headquarters where executives preferred their bad news filtered through catered coffee and controlled lighting. Claire insisted on the plant because truth, when it concerns working people, should be delivered where the work actually happens. The building smelled of machine oil, cardboard, metal dust, and the faint burnt edge of coffee that had been sitting too long in a break-room pot. It was not elegant. It was honest, which made it a welcome change from the boardroom. Nearly 400 employees stood between production lines, and folding chairs, some with arms crossed, some whispering, some watching Claire with the wary patience of people who had learned that new owners often arrived smiling before the cuts began. Marjorie Bell stood beside her in a navy work jacket, practical shoes, and the calm presence of someone who knew how factories breathed. Robert Hensley had come too, looking humbled in a way that suited him better than authority ever had. Ethan was not there. His leave of absence had been announced the previous afternoon pending the independent review, and by then Vanessa Cole's resignation had already moved through the office faster than any official memo. The world, Claire thought, had a strange talent for making exits look like coincidences. She stepped up to the temporary microphone, unfolded one page of notes, then set it aside. The prepared statement was clean and legally safe, which meant it had all the warmth of a refrigerator manual. These people deserve better. My name is Claire Whitmore, she began, and the room quieted, not instantly, but gradually, like rain easing off a roof. Some of you remember me. Most of you do not. Years ago, I knew many of your names because I helped answer client calls, track delivery problems, and write proposals that kept orders coming through this plant. My name was not always attached to that work. That changes today. A few faces shifted. Recognition, skepticism, curiosity. All of it fair. I am not here to pretend the last week was simple, she continued. It was not. The company's finances were worse than many of you were told. Your pension reserves were placed at risk in a way that should have been disclosed. That risk has now been removed. Your pensions are protected in writing. The words moved through the crowd before anyone reacted, passing from person to person in lowered voices, in sudden exhales, in one older man near the front taking off his cap and pressing it against his chest. Claire waited. Humans always underestimate the dignity of waiting. They rush through the part where relief becomes real, as if schedules matter more than lungs filling again. When the room settled, she explained the next steps. No immediate layoffs, a full audit, supplier repairs, executive spending cuts, and an employee advisory group that would include plant workers, not just managers with polished titles. She promised no miracles. Miracles were what executives sold when they had run out of plans. She promised transparency, discipline, and the decency of plain language. Afterward, as people began returning to their stations, the young woman from the bus stop approached with an older man beside her. His name was Frank Alvarez, and he had worked at the plant 29 years, just as his daughter had said. He shook Claire's hand with both of his palms rough and warm. My wife cried when I told her, he said quietly. About the pension. Claire felt the words settle somewhere deep, beyond pride, beyond revenge, beyond the neat satisfaction people imagine when they dream of proving someone wrong. I am glad she knows it is safe, Claire said. Frank nodded, then looked toward the production floor. People will work hard for someone who tells them the truth. It was a simple sentence. It was also the kind of business wisdom Ethan had spent millions failing to learn. That evening, Claire left the plant after sunset. A company car waited near the curb, and this time she took it. Because simplicity was not a costume and independence did not require inconvenience for dramatic effect. As the car pulled away, she looked back at the lit windows of the factory and thought of the woman she had been 5 years earlier, carrying a cardboard box out of a life that had called her unnecessary. She wished she could tell that woman something kind. Not that everything would be easy. That would have been insulting. Not that pain would make her stronger. Pain was not a teacher unless someone survived long enough to study it. She would tell her this. One day, the people who mistook your quiet for weakness will learn that you were listening, learning, building, and waiting for the right room. And when that room finally opens, you will not need to shout. You will only need to sign your name. 6 months later, the headquarters of Caldwell and Pierce looked different before anyone touched the glass, the marble, or the company logo. The difference was not in the building. It was in the air. Receptionists no longer lowered their voices when executives crossed the lobby. Assistants no longer watched elevator doors as if bad news might step out wearing Italian shoes. The employee cafe had reopened after years of budget cuts disguised as efficiency, and every Friday morning, workers from the Everett plant, the Worcester supply office, and the Boston headquarters joined the same video call where Marjorie Bell explained numbers in plain English. Claire attended most of those calls from a modest office on the 17th floor, not Ethan's old corner suite. She had turned that suite into a shared strategy room with whiteboards, factory floor maps, and a long table where supervisors could sit beside finance directors without needing permission from someone's ego. Her own office was smaller, quieter, with 2 windows, a wooden desk, and the same worn leather bag resting on a chair near the door. People noticed the bag. Some asked about it. Claire always gave the same answer. It had held important papers before anyone knew they were important. The independent review had ended in March. It was thorough, humiliating for several people, and boring in all the places justice should be boring. No screaming. No spectacle. Just findings, corrective actions, resignations, repayments, and a governance policy so clear even a charismatic executive would have difficulty bending it into a personal kingdom. Ethan left Boston before spring, reportedly for a consulting role in Denver, though Claire never asked anyone to confirm it. His absence did not heal the company by itself. Men like Ethan were rarely the whole disease. They were symptoms that had learned to sign checks. The real work came after he was gone, in repairing trust one ordinary decision at a time. Supplier payments were brought current. The federal contract was retained. The pension fund was independently protected. The Everett plant received new safety upgrades and a training program designed with workers who actually used the equipment, a revolutionary idea, apparently, to ask people about the machines they stood beside for 40 hours a week. On a clear morning in late May, Claire returned to the bus stop on Atlantic Avenue without planning to. She had been walking back from a meeting with a community manufacturing group, carrying coffee in one hand and a folder in the other, when she found herself beneath the cracked glass roof where the whole visible part of the story had begun. The city had warmed into early summer. A florist across the street was setting buckets of peonies on the sidewalk. Traffic moved in impatient bursts. A bus pulled up, doors opening with the same tired sigh, and Claire stood there watching strangers climb aboard, each carrying a private life no one else could measure from the outside. A woman in scrubs, a man with a lunch cooler, a student with headphones, an older woman with a canvas grocery bag. Not one of them looked powerful in the way boardrooms like to define power. That was the mistake, Claire thought. Power was not always a corner office, a luxury car, or a room full of people waiting for you to speak. Sometimes power was a person who had been dismissed so many times she learned to move without applause. Sometimes it was a signature placed carefully at the bottom of a page. Sometimes it was protecting people who would never know the full story. Her phone buzzed. A message from Marjorie. Everett Line 3 is ahead of schedule. Frank Alvarez says the new process is working. Claire smiled at that, not the small restrained smile from the bus months earlier, but something easier. Something earned. She looked once more at the bus, then at the glass tower 2 blocks away, and understood that both belonged to her history now. One had carried her when the world saw nothing worth noticing. The other had finally learned the cost of not noticing. Claire dropped her coffee cup into a nearby trash can, adjusted the folder under her arm, and walked toward the office, unhurried, unseen by most people passing her, and entirely unconcerned. She no longer needed the world to recognize power before she used it wisely.